The evening the silence spoke. The house was quiet in the way only lived-in homes ever are, not empty, not cold, but breathing softly with memory. Outside, Lowe's angels settled into dusk, the sky turning from pale gold to a bruised lavender as the sun slipped behind the hills. Inside, the light was warm and steady, lamps glowing like small promises against the encroaching night. Keanu Reeves stood near the window for a long time, hands loosely folded, watching the city lights begin to blink awake one by one. He wasn't thinking about movies or fame or the endless noise that followed his name everywhere else. Tonight, his mind was somewhere far quieter, pulled inward by something he had carried for years and never found the courage to set down. Across the room, Alexandra Grant sat curled on the couch, a sketchbook resting against her knees. Her pencil moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if she wasn't drawing an image so much as listening to it. The lines on the page were soft and abstract, shapes that hinted at light breaking through shadow, a recurring theme in her work. She glanced up at Keanu more than once, sensing the weight in his stillness. She knew that silence well. It wasn't his usual calm. It was something deeper, heavier, like a door closed not to keep others out, but to keep something in. They had built their relationship on patience, on allowing each other space to be fully human. Alexandra never rushed him when he withdrew into thought. She trusted that when he was ready, he would speak, and when he did, his words would matter. Still, tonight felt different. The air itself seemed to wait. Keanu finally turned away from the window and crossed the room, sitting beside her. The couch dipped slightly under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pencil rested still in Alexandra's hand. He inhaled slowly, as if bracing himself, then exhaled with care. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, his voice gentle but deliberate. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Alexandra closed the sketchbook without looking at the page, her attention fully on him now. "What is it?" she asked, her tone calm, open, unafraid. He hesitated, eyes lowered to his hands. "It's about your family," he said. The word shifted the room. Alexandra straightened slightly, not tense but alert. "My family," she repeated. "What about them?" Keanu nodded once, as if confirming the path he was about to take. "Years ago," he began, "before we met, before our lives crossed in any way, something happened. I didn't understand it at the time. I didn't even know what it meant until much later." He paused, choosing his words carefully. He spoke of a period in his life marked by loss, when grief felt like a constant companion and the world seemed louder than he could bear. One night during a trip to New York, he wandered into a small art gallery simply to escape the noise. He hadn't planned to buy anything. He hadn't even planned to stay. But then he saw a painting that stopped him completely. "It was of a woman standing in the rain," he said softly. She was holding a child's drawing against her chest like it was the most important thing in the world. There was sadness in it, but also strength. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. Alexandra listened, her expression unreadable but intent. "I bought it," he continued. "Not because I understood it, but because it felt like it understood me." He lifted his gaze to meet hers. "That painting was by your mother." The words landed gently but firmly, like a truth that rearranged the air. Alexandra's breath caught. "That can't be right," she said, not defensive, just stunned. "She stopped painting publicly years before that." "That's what I thought too," Keanu replied. "But she told me it was her last piece. She said she painted it for someone she met by chance, someone who looked like they still believed light could return after the storm." Alexandra's eyes glistened. She remembered her mother saying something similar once, years ago, during a quiet afternoon when the rain tapped steadily against the windows. At the time, she hadn't understood it fully. Now the memory surged forward with unexpected clarity. "She didn't know who I was," Keanu said. "I didn't tell her. I was just another stranger that night. But she talked to me like she knew something about me I didn't know myself." Silence filled the room again, but this time it was alive, vibrating with connection. Alexandra placed her hand over her mouth, emotion breaking through her composure. "You've had her painting all this time?" she whispered. He nodded. "It's been with me ever since. I kept it safe. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to reopen wounds. I didn't know how to explain something that felt bigger than explanation." Alexandra stood slowly, her movements careful, as if afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too fast. "Where is it?" she asked. Keanu led her down the hallway to his study, a room filled with books, quiet corners, and the soft scent of wood and paper. He opened a drawer gently and removed a carefully wrapped canvas. As he unwrapped it, Alexandra felt time fold in on itself. The brushstrokes were unmistakable. Her mother's hand, her mother's heart. She sank to her knees, tears spilling freely as years of memory and grief converged into a single, overwhelming point. Keanu knelt beside her, offering presence rather than words, his arm around her shoulders, steady and warm. "She wanted this to find you," Alexandra said through tears, even if she didn't know how or when. Keanu nodded, his voice barely audible. "She once told me that kindness travels on invisible threads, that maybe we don't see where they begin or end, but they always lead somewhere meaningful." That night, long after the tears had softened into quiet reflection, Alexandra's phone rang. It was her sister, her voice unsteady, carrying urgency across the line. She had found something while sorting through old belongings in their family home, a letter, addressed to a man named Keanu. Alexandra looked at him, her heart racing. The past, it seemed, was no longer content to remain silent. The next morning, as they prepared to travel, neither of them knew exactly what they would find. But both felt it clearly. This was no coincidence. Something long hidden was ready to be understood, not just by them, but by everyone whose lives it touched. And somewhere within that unfolding truth was a lesson far greater than any secret, one about kindness, resilience, and how love, when offered freely, never truly disappears. The road where truth began to move. The drive north began before sunrise, the city still half asleep as Keanu Reeves guided the car onto the empty highway. Lowe's angels faded behind them in a wash of pale streetlights and lingering night air, replaced by long stretches of road that seemed to invite reflection rather than distraction. Alexandra sat quietly beside him, her hands folded around the leather strap of her bag, the weight of her mother's painting and the newly discovered letter pressing gently but persistently on her heart. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. It wasn't empty, it was full of memory, of questions finally allowed to breathe. As the sky slowly lightened, Alexandra's thoughts drifted backward, weaving through childhood moments she hadn't visited in years. Her mother at the kitchen table, hands stained with paint, laughing softly even on days when grief sat heavily behind her eyes. There had always been an unspoken sadness there, not sharp, not dramatic, but constant, like a low tide that never fully receded. Alexandra had assumed it was simply loss, the natural ache of loving deeply and losing too soon. Now she wondered if there had been something more, a quiet chapter her mother had never opened aloud. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was far away. He replayed that rainy night over and over, the small gallery, the woman who spoke to him without knowing his name, who treated his pain not as something to be fixed but something to be honored. At the time, he hadn't realized how rare that kind of kindness was. He only knew it had stayed with him, shaping the way he moved through the world afterward. Now, seeing Alexandra beside him, he felt the strange symmetry of it all settle deeper into his bones. They reached the family house by mid-morning, a quiet place tucked away from busy streets, surrounded by trees that had grown tall and patient over the years. Alexandra's sister met them at the door, her expression a mix of relief and uncertainty, as if she sensed that whatever they were about to uncover would change more than just old memories. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, of time paused rather than erased. They gathered around the old dining table, the letter placed carefully between them. Alexandra's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, her mother's handwriting instantly recognizable, elegant, and deliberate, as if every curve of ink carried intention. The words spoke of a stranger met by chance, of a conversation held in the rain, of gratitude for a kindness that arrived when hope felt fragile. As Alexandra read aloud, her voice wavered, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of connection stretching across years and lives. When she finished, no one spoke right away. Even her sister sat very still, absorbing the realization that their mother had carried this story quietly, trusting that it would find its way home when the time was right. Keanu finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady. He admitted something he had never told anyone before, that after that night he had started doing small things differently, choosing patience over anger, generosity over withdrawal, not because he thought it would fix his pain, but because it felt like a way to honor the compassion he had been shown. It was then that Alexandra's sister mentioned something else she had found while cleaning the attic, an old box tucked behind winter coats and forgotten photo albums. Inside were sketches, unfinished paintings, and a journal wrapped in faded cloth. Alexandra opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized her mother's private thoughts, written not for the world but for herself. Page after page revealed reflections on grief, art, and the belief that kindness could outlive loss if it was passed forward with intention. One entry stopped Alexandra cold. Her mother wrote about believing that certain souls crossed paths not by accident, but because they were meant to remind each other of something essential. She wrote about trusting that her daughters would someday understand that love didn't always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it arrived quietly, changed everything, and then waited patiently to be recognized. As the words settled, Alexandra felt a strange sense of calm rise beneath the emotion. This wasn't a story of secrets kept out of fear. It was a story of faith in timing, in the idea that truth revealed too early could overwhelm rather than heal. Keanu reached for her hand, grounding her, his presence steady and unmistakably real amid the flood of memory. Later that afternoon, as light filtered softly through the windows, another figure arrived, someone Alexandra had asked to come without fully explaining why. Sandra Bullock stepped inside with the familiar warmth that had made her such a constant, trusted presence in Keanu's life for years. She listened quietly as Alexandra explained everything, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised, as if she had always sensed that Keanu carried stories deeper than he ever shared publicly. When Sandra finally spoke, her words were gentle but clear. She said that some people were born with the ability to absorb pain without letting it harden them, that Keanu had always been like that, even when the world tried to define him by tragedy instead of resilience. She told Alexandra that whatever her mother had seen in him, whatever thread had connected them, it made sense, because kindness recognized kindness long before logic caught up. The room felt lighter after that, not because the past had been neatly resolved, but because it was finally acknowledged. They spent the rest of the day sharing memories, laughter weaving carefully through tears, the house slowly transforming from a place of quiet grief into one of shared understanding. Alexandra realized that her mother's greatest gift wasn't just the art she left behind, but the way she trusted love to move forward even after she was gone. That night, as they prepared to leave, Alexandra stood alone for a moment in her childhood bedroom, looking out at the darkening sky. She felt her mother's presence not as absence, but as guidance, a steady hand on her back urging her forward rather than pulling her back. When she joined Keanu and Sandra in the car, she knew with certainty that this journey was only beginning. Whatever else waited ahead, it would not be about uncovering more secrets, but about deciding what to do with the truth now that it had been revealed. The road back was quieter still, not with unanswered questions, but with the calm understanding that some connections were meant to unfold slowly, revealing their meaning only when the heart was strong enough to carry it. Where the past asked to be understood, the days that followed did not rush forward the way the world usually did. Instead, time seemed to slow, stretching gently as if it understood that something fragile and important was unfolding. Back in Los Angeles, the familiar rhythm of life waited just beyond reach. But for now, Keanu Reeves and Alexandra Grant existed in a quieter space, one shaped by reflection rather than obligation. The truth they had uncovered had not demanded immediate answers. Instead, it asked for presence, patience, and the courage to sit with what could not be neatly explained. Alexandra found herself returning again and again to her mother's journal, reading not to search for more clues, but to feel closer to the woman who had shaped her without ever fully revealing herself. What struck her most was not the sorrow in those pages, but the steadiness, the refusal to let pain define the boundaries of love. Her mother had written about grief as something that softened people if they allowed it, something that widened the heart rather than closing it. Alexandra began to understand that the secret her mother left behind was never meant to shock or destabilize the family. It was meant to complete a circle, to show them that kindness given freely always finds its way back. Keanu, meanwhile, carried his own reckoning. Late one evening, when the city lights glowed softly beyond the windows, he finally spoke about a part of his past he rarely shared. He talked about how loss had once made him withdraw from the world, how he had learned to survive by becoming invisible in his own life. Meeting Alexandra's mother, even briefly, had disrupted that instinct. She had not tried to fix him or ask for anything in return. She had simply seen him, and that had been enough to alter the course of his choices. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that his path had not been shaped solely by tragedy, but also by moments of grace that arrived quietly and left lasting imprints. As they talked, the presence of Sandra Bullock lingered in the background of their thoughts, not as an interruption, but as a stabilizing force. She had checked in often since that day at the family home, not prying, not pressing for details, but offering a steady reminder that they were not alone in processing what felt so personal. Sandra understood something about living in the public eye while guarding a private interior life, and her support came not in grand gestures, but in thoughtful messages and gentle humor that reminded them both to breathe. One afternoon, Alexandra made a decision that surprised even herself. She suggested that they bring her mother's painting out of storage, not to display it publicly, but to let it exist openly within their shared space. When Keanu carefully placed it against the wall in the living room, the room seemed to change, not dramatically, but subtly, as if something unseen had settled into place. Alexandra stood before it for a long time, studying the brushstrokes she had known since childhood, noticing details she had never seen before. The woman in the painting did not look defeated by the rain. She looked present within it, grounded, alive. That night, Alexandra dreamed of her mother for the first time in years. There were no words in the dream, no explanations, only a shared understanding that what had been left behind was exactly what needed to be found. She woke with a sense of calm that felt earned rather than borrowed, a quiet certainty that the past had finally loosened its grip. In the days that followed, conversations turned toward the future, not in terms of plans or public announcements, but in the subtler choices that defined daily life. Alexandra spoke about wanting to create work that honored resilience without romanticizing pain, art that acknowledged suffering but refused to let it be the final word. Keanu listened, recognizing his own values reflected back at him in her intentions. He realized that the secret he had carried for so long had not been a burden meant to weigh him down. It had been a responsibility, one that asked him to continue choosing kindness even when no one was watching. What neither of them said aloud, but both understood, was that this journey had shifted something fundamental. The story was no longer about a hidden connection or a remarkable coincidence. It was about how people choose to respond when life offers them meaning without instructions. Alexandra's mother had trusted them to find their own answers, to live in a way that honored what she believed without turning it into something performative or public. As another evening settled in, Alexandra and Keanu sat together in silence once more, but this time it felt different. The quiet no longer carried the weight of withheld truth. It carried understanding, layered and incomplete, but honest. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city moved on, unaware that something small yet profound had shifted within one household. And while the world would never know the full story, both of them sensed that the most important part was not meant to be shared widely at all. It was meant to be lived, slowly and deliberately, in the way they treated others, and in the way they chose to move forward together. They did not know then that one final piece of the past still waited to surface, something that would challenge not only what they understood about Alexandra's mother, but what Keanu believed about himself. For now, it was enough to rest in the knowledge that the truth, once spoken, had not broken them. It had quietly given them permission to grow. The truth that waited in quiet places. What changed most after those days of reflection was not the shape of their lives, but the depth with which they now inhabited them. The world outside continued exactly as before, schedules demanding attention, obligations resurfacing, conversations returning to familiar topics, yet beneath all of it ran a newly awakened current of awareness. Keanu Reeves felt it most strongly in moments when he was alone, when there was nothing to distract him from the echo of his own thoughts. The secret he had finally shared no longer pressed against his chest like a weight, but it had opened a door he could no longer pretend was closed. Memories he had long compartmentalized now asked to be understood rather than endured. Alexandra sensed this shift before he spoke of it. She noticed it in the way he lingered longer in quiet rooms, in how his gaze softened when he looked at her mother's painting, in the way his silences had changed from guarded to searching. One evening, as the light outside dimmed into a muted amber, she invited him to walk with her, no destination in mind, just movement and air and space for whatever might surface. They wandered through side streets and tree-lined paths where the city noise dissolved into distant murmurs, the kind of places where thoughts naturally slowed. As they walked, Keanu began to talk, not with the careful framing he had used before, but with an honesty that surprised even him. He spoke about the years after loss had hollowed him out, about how he had learned to live gently so he wouldn't fracture further. He admitted that he had often mistaken endurance for healing, believing that surviving quietly was the same as moving forward. Meeting Alexandra's mother had been the first time someone challenged that belief without confrontation. simply by showing him that presence itself could be restorative. Alexandra listened without interruption, her attention steady and compassionate. She recognized something deeply familiar in his words, the same pattern she had seen in her mother's journals, the same way grief could masquerade as strength if left unquestioned. For the first time, she understood that the connection between them was not symbolic or abstract, but profoundly human. They had both been shaped by loss, not in identical ways, but in ways that resonated across time. Later that week, Alexandra decided to revisit a place she had avoided for years, her mother's old studio, a modest space tucked behind a converted warehouse where light poured in through tall, narrow windows. The room still smelled faintly of paint and dust, as if creativity itself had settled into the walls. She asked Keanu to come with her, unsure of what she was seeking, only knowing that something there remained unresolved. When they stepped inside, Alexandra felt the familiar ache of memory tighten and then unexpectedly soften. She moved slowly through the space, touching old brushes, examining half-finished canvases, feeling her mother's presence not as absence, but as a quiet invitation. Keanu stood back at first, respectful of the intimacy of the moment, until Alexandra called him over to a large canvas leaned against the far wall. It was unfinished, the central figure only faintly sketched, but the posture was unmistakable. A person standing at the edge of light and shadow, neither fully turned away nor fully stepping forward. "My mother started this near the end," Alexandra said softly. "She never talked about it. I think she didn't know how to finish it." Keanu studied the canvas carefully, his chest tightening as recognition stirred. "It looks like someone deciding whether to stay hidden," he said quietly. Alexandra nodded, or deciding whether to be seen. The realization settled between them with quiet clarity. This was the part of the story that had not yet been spoken aloud, the part that belonged not to the past, but to the choices still ahead. Alexandra understood then that her mother's secret was never meant to be a singular revelation. It was an ongoing question, one that asked each person it touched to decide what they would do with the understanding it offered. That evening they were joined by Sandra Bullock, who arrived without ceremony, carrying takeout containers and her characteristic warmth. She listened as Alexandra described the studio and the unfinished painting, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. Sandra had long believed that people often left the most important things unfinished, not because they lacked courage, but because they trusted others to complete them in their own way. She reminded them gently that meaning was not something inherited intact, but something shaped through choice. The three of them talked late into the night, not about secrets anymore, but about responsibility, about what it meant to carry forward the best parts of those who had influenced them. Keanu admitted that for years he had tried to live quietly so as not to disrupt the world, believing that restraint was a form of respect. Sandra challenged him softly, suggesting that sometimes presence itself was a gift, that allowing oneself to be fully human, visible in both strength and vulnerability, could be an act of generosity. When the night finally grew still, Alexandra found herself alone again with her mother's painting, the one that had begun this journey. She studied it now with new eyes, seeing not just a woman in the rain, but a message carried forward through intention rather than explanation. Her mother had trusted the future to interpret her work honestly, without forcing clarity before it was earned. Keanu joined her, standing quietly at her side. "I think I understand now," he said after a long moment. "She didn't leave me something to keep, she left me something to live." Alexandra reached for his hand, her grip gentle but sure. She knew that what lay ahead would not be simple or predictable, but it would be grounded in something real, something tested by loss and strengthened by empathy. The past had finally revealed what it needed to reveal. What remained was the harder, braver task of honoring it not with words, but with choices that carried kindness forward into places that still needed it. Neither of them realized yet that one final encounter awaited them, a moment that would bring the journey full circle and ask them to step fully into the light their lives had been quietly moving toward. But for now, it was enough to know that the secret had done what it was meant to do. It had not bound them to history. It had freed them to meet the future with open hearts. The moment the circle began to close, the realization that something still waited to be understood did not arrive with urgency, but with a steady, unmistakable pull. In the days after visiting the studio, Keanu Reeves found himself waking earlier than usual, the quiet hours before dawn feeling charged with meaning rather than emptiness. He would sit near the window as the sky slowly shifted from indigo to pale blue, thinking not about what had already been uncovered, but about what had been carefully left unresolved. Alexandra's mother had trusted time, people, and kindness to complete what she could not, and that trust now rested gently but firmly in their hands. Alexandra felt it too, though it manifested differently. She began painting again with an intensity that surprised her, not driven by grief or nostalgia, but by clarity. Her brush moved with purpose, layering light over shadow, allowing imperfections to remain visible rather than corrected. She realized that for the first time in years, she was not painting to process loss, but to acknowledge continuity. Her mother's presence no longer lived only in memory. It lived in motion, in the act of creating something honest without demanding certainty. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes that had been moved from the studio to their home, Alexandra discovered an old envelope tucked inside a book on art theory. The paper was thin, slightly yellowed, and her mother's handwriting stretched across the front, deliberate and calm. It was addressed simply, without flourish, to the one who finds this when ready. Alexandra's hands stilled as she held it, the weight of intention unmistakable. She did not open it right away. Instead, she placed it on the table and waited for Keanu to come home, instinctively knowing this was not something meant to be faced alone. When he arrived, she handed it to him without a word. He studied it quietly, then met her eyes, understanding passing between them without explanation. Together, they opened it carefully. Inside was a single page written not as a confession, but as guidance. Alexandra read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion gathering beneath the surface. Her mother wrote about believing that some people enter our lives briefly, not to stay, but to redirect us toward who we are meant to become. She wrote that kindness, once received, carried a responsibility not to repay the giver, but to extend it outward unconditionally. As Alexandra reached the final lines, Keanu felt something inside him settle, like a long-held breath finally released. The letter did not ask for remembrance or reverence. It asked for courage, the courage to remain open even when experience taught caution. It was not about honoring the past through preservation, but about honoring it through action. That evening, they invited Sandra Bullock to join them, not out of necessity, but out of trust. Sandra listened as Alexandra read the letter again, her expression thoughtful and quietly moved. She spoke about how rare it was to encounter people who understood that influence was not about control or permanence, but about planting something that could grow beyond you. She reminded them both that living with integrity in a complicated world was itself a form of service, one that did not require explanation or validation. The conversation drifted late into the night, touching on the ways each of them had been shaped by unseen hands, mentors, chance encounters, and moments of unexpected grace. Keanu admitted that for years he had underestimated the impact of small kindnesses, believing they were insignificant against the scale of suffering he had witnessed. Alexandra countered gently that perhaps their very subtlety was what allowed them to endure, to travel quietly from one life to another without resistance. In the days that followed, something shifted decisively. Keanu began engaging with the world not as someone passing through carefully, but as someone fully present. He took meetings he might once have declined, not for attention, but for alignment, choosing projects that reflected the values he now recognized as essential rather than incidental. Alexandra, inspired by the letter, began planning an exhibition that would not center on her mother directly, but on the idea of unseen influence, art that spoke to connection without explanation. As these plans took shape, Keanu found himself returning to a memory he had rarely revisited, a conversation with Alexandra's mother that he had always assumed was finished. He realized now that it was incomplete, not because something was missing, but because it had been ongoing all along, carried forward through his choices, his silences, his persistence in kindness even when it seemed unremarkable. One evening, as Alexandra worked late in her studio, Keanu stood alone with the unfinished canvas they had found weeks earlier. He studied it closely, tracing the faint outline of the figure at its center. Without overthinking, he picked up a pencil and added a single, subtle line, not altering the image, but completing the posture, shifting it almost imperceptibly toward the light. When Alexandra saw it later, she did not question the addition. She understood immediately. Some things were finished not by skill, but by intention. They stood together in the quiet afterward, aware that the journey that began with a secret was approaching its resolution. The past had offered everything it needed to offer. What remained was the present, unfolding steadily, asking only that they continue forward with the same patience and honesty that had guided them here. Neither of them knew exactly what the final shape of this story would be, but both sensed that it would not arrive as a revelation. It would arrive as recognition, quiet and complete, when the time was right. And somewhere in the spaces between thought and feeling, the circle that had begun years ago in the rain was slowly, deliberately closing, not with an ending, but with a beginning strong enough to stand on its own. What remained after everything was known? By the time the final piece of understanding arrived, it did not announce itself with drama or certainty. It came quietly, the way truth often does when it has nothing left to prove. The secret that had once lived in silence had finished its work, not by revealing one last surprise, but by changing the way everything around it was seen. What remained was not mystery, but meaning, and meaning did not demand explanation. It only asked to be lived. The morning it fully settled, the city woke beneath a gentle, overcast sky, clouds soft and unhurried, as if the world itself had slowed to match the rhythm of their lives. Keanu sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, watching light shift across the walls. For the first time in years, his thoughts did not drift backward. They stayed with him, present and grounded, no longer pulled toward old grief or unanswered questions. He realized that the secret he had carried for so long had never been about protecting others from pain. It had been about protecting himself from hope. Letting it go had not weakened him. It had steadied him. Alexandra moved quietly through the house, preparing canvases for the exhibition she had finally committed to, not as a tribute, not as a memorial, but as an offering. The work no longer felt like something she was creating alone. It felt collaborative in a way that transcended time, as if her mother's trust had passed fully into her hands, no longer asking to be held, only carried forward. She understood now that her mother had never intended her art to be preserved unchanged. She had intended it to evolve through others, to breathe in new spaces, to be shaped by new lives. When they spoke that morning, their words were few but complete. There was no need to revisit what had been uncovered, no need to analyze or revisit the journey step by step. They both felt it clearly. The past had given them everything it could. Holding on to it now would only diminish what it had offered. This was not forgetting. This was integration. Later that day, they walked together through a small neighborhood park, a place unremarkable in every way except for the way sunlight filtered through the trees. Children played nearby, laughter rising and falling without self-consciousness. An older couple sat on a bench, hands intertwined, speaking softly, their words lost to distance but their connection unmistakable. Alexandra watched these small moments with a clarity that felt new, as if the world itself had become more detailed now that she was no longer searching for something hidden beneath it. Keanu felt it too. He noticed how easily he smiled, not out of politeness or habit, but out of genuine recognition. Life had not become simpler, it had become truer. He understood now that kindness was not a response to suffering. It was a stance, a way of moving through uncertainty without hardening. The woman who had once spoken to him in the rain had not changed his life by giving him answers. She had changed it by reminding him that openness was not naive but brave. As the exhibition approached, Alexandra stood alone one evening in the gallery space, the walls still bare, the floor echoing softly beneath her steps. She imagined her mother there, not as a presence watching from the shadows, but as a current running through the room, subtle and alive. She did not feel sadness. She felt continuity. When the first piece was hung, she stepped back and saw it clearly. This was not an ending to a story. It was a continuation, one that did not belong to the past, but to anyone willing to stand in front of it and feel something real. On opening night, the room filled slowly, voices low, movements respectful, people drawn not by spectacle but by atmosphere. Keanu remained near the edge, observing quietly, not as someone hiding, but as someone choosing stillness. He watched strangers pause in front of the artwork, their expressions shifting subtly, recognition flickering across faces he would never know. And in that moment, he understood fully what the secret had been preparing him for. This was not about being seen. It was about allowing something meaningful to pass through him into the world. When Alexandra joined him, she did not ask what he was thinking. She already knew. They stood side by side, not bound by history, not defined by revelation, but aligned by choice. The journey they had taken had stripped away nothing essential. It had only revealed what had always been there beneath the noise. As the night wound down and the gallery grew quiet again, Alexandra looked at him and spoke with a certainty that needed no emphasis. "She trusted us," she said, "not to remember her but to continue what she believed." Keanu nodded slowly. "And we don't have to do anything extraordinary," he replied. "We just have to stay honest." Outside, the city lights reflected softly on wet pavement as a light rain began to fall, steady and unremarkable, the kind that soaked in rather than overwhelmed. They stepped into it without rushing, letting it touch their shoulders, their hair, their hands. There was no symbolism to search for anymore. The rain was just rain, and that somehow made it perfect. The secret had changed everything not by altering their lives dramatically, but by restoring their faith in something simple and enduring. That kindness given freely does not disappear, that love offered without demand does not weaken, and that truth, when met with patience, always arrives at the moment it can finally be carried. They walked on together, not toward an ending, but into a life no longer shaped by what was hidden, only by what they chose to give next.